Hey y'all, Azim here. We are taking a look at different lymphoid tissues. Lymphoid tissues are organs within our bodies, of course, that work in some way to filter blood of pathogens and other particles and help maintain fluid levels. So we can divide up our lymphoid tissues into primary and secondary lymphoid tissues. Primary lymphoid tissues are where lymphocytes are made or where they mature. So right now we're looking at one of the primary lymphoid tissues. This is red bone marrow, which is found in the proximal epiphyses of long bones. That was 40x, here's 100x. Here is 400x. We've seen this before. We looked at it before because we saw these larger cells here. Those are megakaryocytes, and they can become, or they split. They keep growing but shed off to form platelets. And the rest of these nuclei are nuclei of stem cells, which can form erythrocytes, but can also form leukocytes, including lymphocytes. Lots of sites, I know. But yeah, so red bone marrow counts as not only part of the circulatory system, but also part of the lymphatic system. It produces lymphocytes. Specifically, the type of lymphocyte that it helps produce are B lymphocytes, B cells. B is for bone. We're in the bone marrow. The other kind of lymphocyte, T lymphocytes, are also initially made here because all blood cells are made here. But T lymphocytes, they mature in a different organ called the thymus. Don't confuse it with the thyroid. We saw about the thyroid when we were looking at the endocrine system. The thyroid is sitting on top of the larynx and trachea. The thymus is above the heart, superior to the heart, inferior to the thyroid. And as children, we have it, but we don't really have it as adults. Most adults, it's gone away. It's kind of been replaced by fat. We don't need it because we develop that kind of immunity earlier on in life. And you'll learn all about that in physiology. But right now we're looking at the thymus. I want you to pay attention to all these big blobs, where these blobs are, kind of scattered, just kind of pressed all over. There is some fat in the middle here. See all those fat cells, adipocytes? And these blobs, you can see how it's darker towards the outside and lighter in the middle. The darker part on the outside is where you have a higher concentration of cells, because darker means nuclei, and that's where you'd find the T lymphocytes developing. T lymphocytes develop in the thymus. Take a close look here because it gets really confusing when we start looking at the other lymphoid organs. They all start looking very, very similar. It's just collections of slightly darker areas and slightly lighter areas in roundish organizations. But here it's all kind of blobs everywhere, and each blob, it's darker towards the outside of that's its cortex, and its medulla, the middle, it's lighter. This is 40x. This is 100x. This is 400x. The arrow's on an adipocyte right now, but go to the side there and you'll see all these lymphocytes. T lymphocytes developing in the thymus. Just big round nucleus. So those are your two primary lymphoid organs. Secondary lymphoid organs are organs where they're not generating, they're not the ones responsible for generating or maturing lymphocytes, but you can still have lymphocytes being born here by mitosis, so you can have lymphocytes proliferating here. Proliferation is different from original generation or maturation. Secondary lymphoid organs are ones that filter your lymph fluids, and your lymph fluids are basically just runoff from your blood vessels. Just like if you have a water filtration plant that's cleaning up runoff from the sewers, which came originally from rain or whatever else. Here, we're taking runoff from our blood. We don't want it to accumulate too much in the interstitial fluid because that'll cause edema. We don't want to build up of fluid in the interstitial fluid. So we're taking it, cleaning it, and then returning it back to the circulatory system. That's what a secondary lymphoid tissue is. Right now, we're looking at the spleen. The spleen, we've discussed before, is a region where we can do two important functions. We can destroy old and damaged red blood cells, old and damaged erythrocytes, and we can also do what I just said, clean up our blood for any pathogens or other things. So what you'll hopefully notice is that It's not as blob-like as what we saw with the thymus, but there are darker spots and there are lighter spots. The darker spots are in circular arrangements, and they're kind of just all over the place. There's no real arrangement to them, but there are lots of circular regions that are darker and then lighter regions in between. Now, this is kind of a counterintuitive thought, or name, but the darker regions are the white pulp. Darker regions are the white pulp. The lighter regions are the red pulp. Why is the darker region the white pulp? This is where we find white blood cells. And if you remember, white blood cells have nuclei, while red blood cells don't. So that's why these areas are darker, because we're seeing the nuclei, the cluster of white blood cells, specifically lymphocytes. Over here in the red pulp, we have mostly old, damaged red blood cells that need to be destroyed. What are the cells that are destroying the red blood cells, the erythrocytes? It's macrophages, another kind of leukocyte. So let's take a closer look. That was 40x. Here is 100x. Again, this darker portion, those circular portions, the nodules, those are the white pulp. Out here is the red pulp. Let's go to 400x. Nice big round nuclei of the lymphocytes of the white pulp. Over here, where you do see darker nuclei, those are the macrophages. Where you see lightness, those are the erythrocytes. And remember, erythrocytes don't have nuclei. So that's why it appears lighter. So that's the spleen. Spleen's important for destroying old and damaged red blood cells and recycling those materials, like the iron in it and proteins, and also for filtering our lymph. Spleen is a secondary lymphoid tissue. This next tissue, also another secondary lymphoid tissue. Notice it also has circular arrangements. These circular arrangements, these lymphoid nodules, are darker on the outside and a bit lighter in the middle. The reason why they're lighter in the middle is because more cells are undergoing mitosis here. Lymphocytes are undergoing mitosis. These are called germinal centers. Germinal, like to germinate. Like when you germinate a seed, you're helping it sprout. Here, you're helping more lymphocytes develop. They're undergoing mitosis. They're not maturing. They're already mature. Here, they're just undergoing mitosis. Again, there's a difference between differentiation, maturation. There's a difference between maturation and proliferation, undergoing more mitosis. So all these nodules, we're in the tonsil. This is one of the tonsils. They are scattered all over the place. We have a capsule on the very outside, a reticular tissue capsule protecting all of this. I just want you to know that it kind of looks like the thymus a little bit, but not as blobby, kind of pressed together, and the centers are a bit lighter because that's where you find the germinal centers. Going a little closer, this is 100x now. Here's the germinal center, and then where you find most of the lymphocytes towards the outside. There is reticular tissue all spread throughout because it's helping reinforce the tissue, the organ. Let's see what we can see at 400x. Oops, 400x. Our focus is a bit off. Interesting. Sorry, it's not in focus right now. That's as good as I'm going to get. Okay. Not a whole lot to see, just lots of dots. Those are mostly the lymphocytes. So we can get a better view of the lymphoid follicles or nodules at this lower 100x or 40x magnification. We're going to see that pattern of these lymphoid follicles, these lymphoid nodules, just circular arrangements with germinal centers and other secondary lymphoid tissues. So this was a tonsil. We saw the spleen, we saw a tonsil. This next one, let's go to 40x again. This next one is a lymph node. Lymph nodes are those things that swell when you're sick sometimes. You can find them in your neck. You have cervical lymph nodes. You can find them in your armpit. Those are axillary lymph nodes. You can find them in your groin. Those are inguinal lymph nodes. There are other lymph nodes, but those are high concentrations of them, and those are ones you can palpate, ones you can feel with your hands, and if they're swelling, that could be indicative of infection. Why is that helpful? Because in those germinal centers, at the centers of those lymphoid nodules, that's where more and more lymphocytes will undergo mitosis in response to an infection. Lymph nodes are a bit smaller, and they tend to have this hilum where blood vessels come in. You can see a blood vessel there. So a lot rounder in shape. The lymphoid nodules tend to be clustered towards the perimeter, so they tend to be darker towards the perimeter, but there's still those circles. Let's go to 100x. Again, you can see the lymphocytes are in there in those lymphoid nodules. Let's go to 400x. Those are lymphocytes. If we're lucky, we can find lymph vessels branching out. There are lymph vessels that branch out from in and out of the lymph follicle, because the lymph node, because the lymph node is there to help filter all that lymph fluid. So we want lots of circulation of lymph in and out of these lymph nodes. So this is a lymph node. Lining our mucosa meaning any tract within our bodies, or our digestive tract, respiratory tract, urinary, reproductive tracts, we have lymphoid tissues deep to the mucous membrane, deep to the mucosa, so deep to the epithelium and areolar connective tissue. Specifically, so that's called mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, MALT. Specifically in the intestines, the part of intestines called the ileum, the latter portion of the small intestines, we have something called Peyer's patches. So this is the ileum. We'll be able to recognize later what makes this the ileum. One thing is it has these villi facing the lumen, and it's a fairly big tube, relative to what we'll see next. But deep to these villi, which are made of simple columnar epithelium and areolar connective tissue, you see these roundish nodules over here. I'm just tracing it with this arrow. Here's a roundish nodule, here's a roundish nodule. These are lymphoid follicles with germinal centers in the center. They're known as Peyer's patches, P-E-Y-E-R''S, Peyer's patches. This is 40x. If you go deeper to that, you'll find the smooth muscle. So don't go too deep to the smooth muscle. It's superficial to the smooth muscle. Here is a better view at 100x. Here's one of the Peyer's patches. Here's another, another, and so on. And you can see the lighter germinal center in the middle. And those are the lymphocytes of the Peyer's patches, these lymphoid follicles of the Peyer's patches. You want these lymphoid tissues lining your mucosa because your mucosa is basically facing the outside of your body. These lumen spaces, these tracts, are technically the outside of your body. They're exposed to things from the outside all the time, and you need protection from those things. Here we're looking at another part of the digestive tract with a much smaller lumen. You see this white space right here? That's the lumen. Much, much smaller. There aren't villi. These are actually called crypts. They go more in than they come out. So small lumen, crypts, no villi. This is the appendix. The appendix is where another lymphoid organ. You probably think of the appendix as a region that can get infected, and it is. I have my appendix out, same as tonsils. But when it is functioning normally, it can help with immune function, with lymphoid function. Just like what we saw in the ileum, deep to these villi, deep to these crypts, deep to the epithelium, you see these darker areas with a lighter in the middle, here and here and here. These are lymphoid follicles of the appendix, the vermiform appendix. That was 40x. Here's 100x, lighter middle circular follicle, lighter middle circular follicle. Let's go to 40x. And those are the lymphocytes being born in the centers. Here we go. Lymphocytes being born in the center of these lymphoid follicles. That's the appendix. Last, lymph tissue is not a lymph organ, it's a lymph vessel. So what's carrying all this lymph fluid throughout the body? Almost like it's paralleling the circulatory system, the blood circulatory system. These are lymph vessels. Lymph vessels, like veins, have valves. See this valve right here? See how the flap of it, focus, how the flap of it is kind of pointing in this way? That means fluid can flow from this area to this area in one direction, but it won't go backwards. The valve is only open in that one direction. How do you tell the difference between a vein and a lymph vessel? Well, in this longitudinal cut, this isn't a cross-section, this is longitudinal. Let's look a little closer. You'll notice that we don't really see many layers. It has an endothelial layer, simple squamous epithelium that makes up the endothelium. But you don't see those other layers like tunica intima, media, externa. Like veins have a large externa. And we see fat out here, but that's just fat. That's just holding everything together on the outside. You don't see any, and here's the large lumen space in the middle. You don't really see any layers, and that's how we can differentiate lymph vessels from veins. All right, if you watched this video, you made it. Thanks for listening. Those are all the lymph tissues I'd like you to know as far as histology goes. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for watching. Take care.